Right. Testing audio.
I better go on another because it's just gonna do this. It says wait.
Okay, testing. Testing again. Okay, testing. I am not getting an echo anymore. Okay, people in the chat are saying it's good. Okay, thanks everyone for bearing with us. Apologies for those technical difficulties. Hi, I'm Laura Lapierre. I'm the Wetlands Program Manager. I'm here tonight to present to you on this rulemaking proposal. We also have in the room our commissioner.
I can turn my.
Which I can show.
Good evening, everyone.
Yes, apologies again for the technology. But we are here, we're ready, we have our presentation up. So I'll start with just that we are being recorded tonight. So if you have a colleague who can't make it to tonight or the next presentation, that's tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We can certainly provide you with the presentation, and we're hoping to put that up on YouTube. Today is December 15th, 2025, and it is 5:09 p.m. Thanks everybody for joining with us. We have one person in the room here in Springfield and quite a few folks on video on virtual. So thanks everyone for muting yourselves and such. So tonight we have time for a short presentation about the rule changes, and also want to spend the majority of our time tonight to provide time for you to give comment on this rule. So what we'll do is I'll jump into the presentation, and you can ask me clarifying questions about what the contents of the rule are from the presentation, and then we'll be getting into time for you to provide comments. We have quite a few people here, and as just part of the rulemaking, we won't be having a back and forth conversation about comments and such. We will be responding in writing at a later date. Once we receive all of the comments, which will be until January 15th. Okay. Any questions on the format? Not, I'll jump right in. People calling in should mute. And if you can, Rebecca, just you have the ability to mute them. Yep. Thanks. Yes. So doing that, I'll be able to hear. So a little bit of housekeeping. There's your mute button on Teams. You can turn off video so that you have more bandwidth, and some of you have already seen the the chat room where you can provide your comments there. You can also raise your hand. So you can ask, we can turn your mic on and you can ask your question once we're through with the presentation. Okay, so the outline for this presentation is I want to first explain what our existing rule is, why we're here on creating a rule change, spend most of the time describing what those rule changes are, give some specifics on how you can figure out if your area, your neighborhood, your project might be eligible for this allowed use. And also I'll be ending with how we're improving our wetland mapping because it would have more of a importance jurisdictionally for wetland protection. Okay, so just starting off, for folks of you who aren't real familiar with the Vermont Wetland rules, they have been in place since 1990, with the intent of protecting the significant functions and values that they provide, such as things like wildlife habitat, flood storage, water quality protection, recreational value, etc. And back in 1990, we had class 2 wetlands were protected as mapped on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. And any of those areas that were mapped or contiguous or connected to those mapped areas would be considered class 2 and protected. Understanding that not all wetlands are mapped, there was an update in 2010 to include significant wetlands that are not mapped as class 2. So wetlands on the ground are where lands and waters meet. You need to use science in order to evaluate the eggs. You look for wet soils, which this image in the upper corner is showing. Wet soils, water-loving plants, and signs of water is where you can define the edge of the wetland versus where it is solidly upland. And we have a classification system. Class 1 wetlands are exceptional in function and value. They're all listed in the appendix of the wetland rules. And class 3 wetlands are determined to not be significant and are not regulated by the state. We also protect wetland buffers. Class 2 wetlands have a 50-foot wetland buffer. Class 1 wetlands, it varies. Typically, they're 100 feet. And so any activities within those wetlands or their buffers requires a permit unless that activity is called out as an allowed use in the rule. And we issue permits when an activity cannot be placed elsewhere and the functions and values are not adversely affected, or those adverse effects are mitigated. I can say about half of our permits currently are for residential housing projects, and we issue around 220 permits a year. So why are we here? We received an executive order. Governor Phil Scott signed an executive order to promote housing, construction, and rehabilitation in Vermont. And this order compels several steps to be taken by agency and boards of the state of Vermont to support housing by streamlining requirements to which housing projects in Vermont are subject to. It has a specific piece on environmental review streamlining and modifications to the Vermont wetland rules, establishing designated areas, not requiring permits for unmapped class 2 wetlands, and reducing the buffer zones of the mapped wetlands down to 25 feet from 50 feet. And that's section 3.1, which in the chat, we're adding links in here so that you're able to look into more information on these things. Yeah, so the Department of Environmental Conservation has determined that to implement this executive order, we need to go through formal amendments to the Vermont wetland rules. So certain changes to the wetland permitting under this section of the executive order are not effective immediately. We've initiated rulemaking with a target for rule adoption in February. And in the interim, the current Vermont wetland rules are still in effect. It's important to note that Act 121 of last year requires us to also go into rulemaking for specific wetland rule changes. Those are not included in this rule change effort. Those are more extensive. They have been being worked on, but at this point, they're not in this proposal. So the rule proposal edits have three pieces to it. The first piece, which will be the majority of this presentation, is an addition of an allowed use for residential housing, which is types of projects that do not need permitting. That's the allowed use section of the rule. The sections 8.4 and 9.6 would remove the reconsideration process, which is a step in between the permit and petition and a formal appeal. So that would shorten the length of time for a final decision if there is by not allowing a reconsideration, but also still allows public process on both the public comment period and through the formal appeal. Section 8.5 is amended to standardize our map edit process. There's a few different ways that we do public commenting for that, and making this change would standardize and simplify that for easier administration. Okay, so Section 6.26 is the bulk of the changes, and it's getting to the executive order's requirement of activities that are in wetland and buffer that don't need a permit. So this is basically stating that construction of residential housing projects and related required utilities for those housing projects in designated areas and 25 feet from a mapped wetland area is an allowed use. Also, if the necessary utilities are within a mapped wetland or 25 feet of a mapped wetland, and is following best management practices, that's also an allowed use. So that's a mouthful. And I'm going to go through some definitions of various pieces of that rule edit. So first, residential housing project, there's a specific definition: single family, multi-unit or multifamily housing projects, shelter projects, or even mixed use projects that include a residential housing component are considered residential housing projects. This definition does not include ancillary improvements to existing housing that are not necessary for the primary residential function. So if you need an updated septic system, that's necessary for the housing function, so it would qualify. Expanding your lawn isn't necessary, so it does not qualify. And then the required utilities for the residential housing project are included under this allowed use. So your electricity, gas, water, sewer lateral, access road, driveway, or septic force main. That's the extent of the list of required utilities that would qualify. Okay, so designated area is a bigger piece to define. There are 5 different designated areas under this allowed use. So, and I have a few slides for this. So this is a lot on this first slide, but I'll get to more detail. So firstly, anything that's designated as a downtown development district, village center, new town center, growth center, or neighborhood development area that is either served by public sewer or the project can get a wastewater permit qualifies. Any opportunity zones that have a project that can be served by public sewer or get a wastewater permit per the project would qualify. Beyond those areas, if the public sewer or water line extends outside of those areas, which are mapped, I'll show you those. If the public utility extends beyond those areas and the residential project can hook up to one of those systems, those areas also qualify. We do have mapping of some public sewers, but we do not have that for water line. Fourthly and fifthly, we have Act 250 exemption. So Act 250 is Vermont's land use and development law. And there are certain areas that are going to or are interim exempt from Act 250 permitting. So number 4 on this list are Tier 1A and Tier 1B status areas that none of those exist yet. Those are going to be designated by the Land Use Review Board starting in 2026. But in the interim, we have number 5 here, any projects that are eligible under the interim housing exemption for Act 250 would qualify under this as an area under this allowed use. So 1 and 5 have overlap, and I'll get into some of those details. And 4, like I stated before, there are no Tier 1A or 1Bs. Those are starting next year. They'll start being designated and they'll be mapping with that information. Okay, so diving into the details a bit more on the interim exempt areas, which will expire in 2027 once the Tier 1A and Tier 1B projects are all designated. So these include several of the same areas as I mentioned on the last slide, which I have asterisks for those. So designated downtowns, new town centers, growth center, neighborhood developments, and village centers. There is some specificity on the size of the residential housing projects under that interim exemption, but because they're also just generally listed, that means projects of any residential unit size would qualify under the allowed use. Then there's also transit corridors, so areas within a quarter mile of certain transit routes. And then there's areas for priority housing projects. So designated priority housing projects that are within a half mile of a downtown or a neighborhood also qualify for the interim exemptions. And those also need to be determined through the Act 250 process. Don't worry, I will show you some examples in a little bit. So we do have mapping of those areas that likely qualify under this allowed use for residential housing projects. And I have it here on this map in red, just showing the general area. This map does include all the sewer line service areas or municipal water lines. That's something that a person would need to get more detail on. as well as whether your project can hook up to sewer line or if there's suitable soil for wastewater disposal, for opportunity zones. The larger areas you're seeing on this map are mostly opportunity zones. We will be providing a checklist to aid developers in determining whether their project would qualify under this allowed use or not. So there will be more guidance provided on these various layers of area types. So since we're in Springfield, here's a close-up of the areas that would qualify under the allowed use in the greater Springfield area. My presentation tomorrow is going to be in Montpelier, so here's the greater Montpelier area. The interactive map shows more detail. So here is an image of Greater Springfield, and you see the dark pink is designated downtown. So those areas would qualify no matter the size of the housing project, as long as you can hook up to wastewater systems, you're all set to qualify under the allowed use. This light pink area is the priority housing projects. So if the project qualifies for that in these areas, you would qualify as well. But overall, it's within an opportunity zone. So any project within the greater Springfield area, within the whole town of Springfield, would qualify under this allowed use for residential projects. So next spot, here we have Essex Junction, where the dark pink is a downtown development district, which would qualify. Then we have larger priority housing project areas. And I should step back a bit. The blue lines are streams and rivers. This is the Winooski here. The teal are mapped wetlands. The hatched teal is wetland area that's been identified but hasn't formally been placed on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory yet. But this light pink area would also qualify for priority housing projects. This dark blue is all transportation areas, that quarter mile from transit routes that would qualify. And then this light gray area is showing sewer service areas. So those are areas that a project could likely hook up to a sewer line and also qualify. And I see a question about the interactive map. What is the significance of the area hatched with green? Yeah, so those are areas that will be added to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory, but haven't yet gone through that public process of formally being added, which I'll speak to in a little bit. And if they are within, so those are all the wetlands, those teal areas are the wetlands that projects would still need to avoid. So a bit more clarification. So these areas you see on the map that have no overlaying, designated use areas, you would still need to get a wetland delineation. You would still need to evaluate the soils, plants, and hydrology to get the boundary of the wetland, determine if it's class 2, 50-foot buffer zone, and go through our regular permitting process. These other areas circled in yellow would be areas that qualify for the allowed use, The housing projects would be avoiding the mapped areas and 25 feet from the mapped areas, and utilities would, for those projects would also be looking to avoid those, but if there is a crossing, there is some allowance for those, which I'll get into in a little bit. So, here's a little cartoon of explaining the two differences. So on this existing wetland rule side, we have mapped wetland areas, which are darker, and the delineated wetland. So the wetland on the ground that's not included in the mapping is the lighter transparent cattails, just for visualization. So under the existing wetland rules, a project wouldn't need a permit if it stayed 50 feet away from the boundary of the wetland, as well as its access road. Under the proposed rule, the housing project would need to stay outside of the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory mapped wetland area. So even if the wetland extended beyond where it was mapped, you could still build a project 25 feet away from the mapped wetland area, your houses and your access road, and qualify under the allowed use. In addition to that, here's another project that would qualify. You see all of the cattails are opaque, so this is an entirely mapped VSWI wetland. And you see there is a utility, maybe it's a sewer line hookup that is crossing a portion of the wetland. That would still qualify under the allowed use as long as they are following best management practices, which I'll get into on the next slide. So up on the rulemaking page is a whole list of draft best management practices for utility crossings at mapped wetlands. So if the project has a utility that's crossing a mapped wetland. Oh, thanks. Thanks, guys. Sorry about that. Did you guys see the last screen? Here's the last slide, if you guys missed that. Sorry about that. So you see there's the utility line crossing going through the mapped wetland area, and that's something that would need to follow a best management practice. Sorry about that. Technology is not my friend today. Yes, so there's three pieces to the best management practices: some general measures, consideration for erosion prevention, stream protection, prevention of invasive spread, then some activity specific practices for overhead utility, underground lines, and access roads. And then it also has some additional guidance that isn't specifically required, but best way to design your project, and recommendations for the residential areas as well, besides the utility as a recommendation. We at the agency are thinking of changing this from a best management practice under the allowed use to instead be a general permit under the rule. So while you're reading that and providing comment, keep that in consideration. Okay, so that is the allowed use, the big piece of the wetland rule change. As you've heard, a lot of this is around the wetland mapping. We are specifically talking about the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. So there's 3 types of mapping that you see on a regular basis. There's a national wetlands inventory where a lot of our mapping was adopted from. And that's something that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service holds. We have our Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory that specifies jurisdictional wetlands. And then we have a wetland advisory layer that is just advisory. When the program finds wetlands, we'll add that to it so people have a heads up that there's a wetland in that area. But it's the VSWI that is what we're talking about in the wetland rules. So if it's mapped on the VSWI, you would need to have your residential project avoid it and 25 feet from it in order to qualify under the allowed use. The VSWI is a lot better than it used to be. Some areas are better than others. We are poised to update the rest of the state very soon. For example, here's a map of an area in the Winooski Basin in East Montpelier, where you see the light blue is all the wetland area that was added along the stream, and the old VSWI is the green. That mapping was over 40 years old. As you can imagine, we have a lot better technology for doing interpretation of where wetlands are based off of aerial imagery. So this has gotten a lot better. In fact, in the Winooski Basin, we saw an increase in mapped wetland area by 145%. Again, because this is looking at aerial imagery zoomed out, not on the ground, it is not precisely able to find all the areas that have the soils, the water-loving plants, and the hydrology as doing a formal delineation. So for example, here's a site in Barrie where we have the teal areas, the VSWI, and the orange is the field delineation, and then they're overlapping in one area here. About 66% of the actual wetland is not shown on the VSWI map, and that's nearly 1 acre. But we are doing a statewide update. We originally updated the Missisquoi in early 2023. We added these red areas, the Winooski, Otter Creek, and Little Otter Creek, Lewis Creek, this year. The next portion that's coming on is the Connecticut River Basin, which is all this area outlined in green. We're hoping to have that up and ready for a public comment period starting soon. It would be up for public comment for at least 30 days before being adopted onto the map. And then the rest of the state, we're hoping to include by the end of 2026. And of course, we get delineation information from consultants for permitting and such, and we are ongoing working on adding that also to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. So almost done with my presentation, but here is the rulemaking process. So we are at this stage here, the third box. So we filed the rule with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rule. and then filed with the Secretary of State. And we are open for public comment right now. And today we're actually on the fourth box. We're at the public hearings. The public comment period is open until the end of January 14th. Once we receive all the comments, we will respond to those comments in writing in a responsiveness summary, and that will be provided in the rulemaking materials that go over to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rule, where there will be another hearing, which there is also a opportunity for the public to testify at that hearing as well, where a group of legislators determine whether this follows statutory intent and can approve, deny, or ask for more work to be done before a rule can be adopted. So I'll stop real soon, but wanted to give a few pointers for providing some comments. So we've been receiving quite a few comments, and for us in constructing this rule and making any changes to the proposal, it is really helpful to provide any data or anecdotal information that you might have on the impacts of the changes that are proposed. It's helpful to include any legal or scientific support for your comments. We also like to just have you discuss the suggestions for how we're going to implement the rule, or point out what issues there might be in implementing the rule. And of course, you know, stories are always helpful. Tell your local story. What would these changes mean in your area of the state? So with that, you know, we'll be taking comments in the chat, raise your hand, or also in the room. If you want to think on it a bit longer, or give a comment now and give more comments later, that's totally fine. We have here this email address that you can submit your comments about this rule to. You can give us those comments all the way up until midnight on January 14th for it to be part of our responsiveness summary. Also, we have another hearing tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So if you have any friends who weren't able to join or colleagues who weren't able to join, please let them know about this. No, it's in Montpelier.
Can you?
Yep.
Give us just a really brief, because I had the time as 6 o'clock. Not 5:30. Could you give us a real brief on what you presented?
This will be it's recorded, and I'm going to be putting it up on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And I can also like get your email address and send you the video as well. So with that, I'm going to well, I guess I can leave the presentation up. So what I started with at 5, sorry for the mix up on the time. But we have folks online as well as here. So we are now that I'm finished the presentation, we're opening for comments. So I'll be calling people as they have a comment. We're giving a time limit of 5 minutes just to make sure everyone can provide their comment. And if there's time left over, someone can speak for a bit longer. We will be accepting the comments right now. We won't be responding to all of the comments right now. So
Have a historical comment on it, and I don't know if you covered it. Why was this brought up to even do a change?
yes, this is an executive order by the governor this September.
You know, what caused him to want to do it? I mean, there must have been, there's must be reasons behind the wanting to make a change.
Yeah, yeah. It is part of the executive order to promote housing is the name of the executive
This
order.
population is 20.
We are here in following this rulemaking process to allow us to implement executive order
Right.
given by, we were not privy
Privy to.
right, so we are following the executive order that was put forth. And we feel like this is the way to implement that executive order in, a formal, transparent. Mechanism.
Well, I'm from the Dummerston Conservation Commission, so I was just interested in some of the nitty-gritty.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. So let's look and see what's on the chat.
Procedurally, then this comment has been duly recorded and noted. I just wanted to make sure you know that everything, what you have spoken will be transcribed and responded to and has been noted. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah. So looking in the chat. I answered the question about the interactive map earlier. Bernard Paquette asked, when an area is reviewed for VSWI, what keeps a delineated wetland from becoming part of the VSWI? Is there a delineation between the two? So there's a few ways we can add wetland areas onto the wetland mapping. That can be through this aerial interpretations that we've been doing statewide, and are going to be included. And then we also receive delineations, which are boots on the ground. A scientist looked at the wetland soils and hydrology and said, okay, this is where the wetland is, here's the boundary. And a lot of times they're submitting us their geospatial information so that we can easily include them onto the mapping. So we can, and the delineated area, if we have both, the delineated stuff is what goes onto the map because that's the more accurate information that we have. Kelly comments, I have so many concerns about this proposed change. Our wetlands have proven to be vital sponges on the landscape for water storage during storms and floods, as well as helping to recharge our groundwater during times of drought. Encroaching on them and draining them or otherwise altering their capacity seems like shooting ourselves in the foot on a massive scale. I'm with the Ottaquechee Natural Resources Conservation District and Black River Action Team. All right, thank you, Kelly, for your comment. Philip Savoy says it appears the wetland changes only affect the Class 2 wetlands that are in downtown areas with town sewer and water. Is that correct? It includes downtown areas, neighborhoods, priority housing project areas, areas that extend beyond these designated areas that have sewer hookups, as well as opportunity zones. So I encourage you to look at the interactive map that we have available here. And I saw a hand raise and go back down in the chat, and I can certainly keep reading the questions, but also encourage folks to provide their comment verbally as well.
See a hand up. Dale. Sorry.
Okay. Dale, go ahead and unmute your mic and give us your comment, please. Let me see, maybe I can. Nope, I can't unmute your mic for you. Are you able to, Rebecca? Okay.
Telephone person.
Laura, Dale also has a question in the chat, so they might have written
Oh, okay.
what was planned to be verbal.
Okay, so the comment though from Dale says, can you say more about the process of updating the VSWI? For example, the city of Burlington has a map that includes wetlands that aren't in the VSWI. If a city wanted them added, how would we go about doing that? Yeah, we could definitely add those. We have a petition process with the form online. If it's a many wetlands, we should probably talk a bit, Dale, to see what exactly you have so we can see what the best way is to add those onto the map. And those would need to also go through a 30-day public comment period and review stage. But we can certainly do that if you have that sort of information for us. Thank you. Okay, another clarifying question from Elise. Is the proposed 25-foot buffer for all wetlands or only those in designated residential areas, etc.? Yeah, so the allowed use is for those designated areas for residential housing projects only. So you might have a designated downtown where someone's looking to build a brewery, and that wouldn't qualify under this allowed use. Isabel asks, how will these updates to the wetland rules work within the Act 121 framework? Thanks, Isabel, for your question. We'll be responding to that one in writing. Tatiana says a key point seems to be the designated areas, in that it seems almost any area can fall into one of those categories. Can you explain the types of areas that would not be considered a designated area? Can you explain what constitutes a neighborhood development and what constitutes an opportunity zone? I am with the Westminster Conservation Commission. Thanks, Tatiana, for your comment. I really encourage folks to go onto that interactive map to see which areas qualify and which areas don't. You can see from this slide, yeah, there's only a few areas that are outside of designated areas in this part of the state, but looking, statewide, you can see the majority of the state is outside of the designated areas. Okay, and Mark, what percentage of land is affected by the buffer reduced to 25 feet? Wouldn't that percentage decrease considering that not all affected parcels are proposed for development? Thanks for your question. I can respond partially to that. The mapped areas that you see on this slide is approximately 6% of the state. But that really depends on, is it a residential housing project? And then there's also the sewer lines or water lines that extend past these red areas that are residential projects could also qualify. So it's not really easy to map all of these. But yes, it does have to specifically be for a residential housing project. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Are there any other comments or questions in the room?
Pretty much asked that, we were fact finding to formally write
Yep, yep.
by the date.
Okay, thank you.
So in your designated wetlands, there's many areas of the state that are undesignated wetlands. But these are the state wetlands.
Yeah, the wetland rules currently protect wetlands with significant functions and values. Not all of them are mapped. We've been working really hard to improve that. But this proposal is for an allowed use for residential housing projects if those projects are not within 25 feet of mapped wetland areas. Okay. Okay, so another question just came in from Philip Savoy. Is there a difference between a neighborhood development wetland and a wetland outside of that area? Why not make the wetland changes for all wetlands in Vermont?
Yeah.
Yep, so we can respond to that in writing. Right now, the proposal is the wetland changes only for those designated areas. Okay. Tatiana, you're welcome, Philip. Tatiana says, was there any scientific or other evidence provided in the executive orders to suggest that 25 feet was sufficient buffer as opposed to 50 feet? If so, how could one obtain that information? The executive order is online. Rebecca, were you able to provide that link in the chat? You have, okay. Yeah, we'll put it in the chat again. So you can read that in its entirety. The executive order doesn't go into details of data about wetlands. We can also provide more information in writing.
Interesting to know the history of the need for the change. That was kind of what I was really interested in, is why is this coming about? Is there, because of the population static decrease? I know down in our area, we're not building a lot particularly. We're not, and it's when you're Brattleboro isn't doing any big building projects. I just would love to know what made him want to make this executive order? I mean, did the public approach him? Did contractors approach him? I just wondered, it didn't come out of nowhere.
Mhm.
What was the research behind meeting it?
Mhm. Yeah, we can certainly, we'll include that into the responsiveness summary as one of the questions to answer.
I think it just.
Mhm. Okay. Um,
I have a question. Is there like an estimation of how many housing units this change in particular could allow for or open up?
I did not see that in the executive order, but there are some numbers in the executive order about what the overall housing need is.
Yeah.
So I don't have that information, but I can include that in our responsiveness summary.
Just wondering if that was. If there was-
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay. Dale asks, what will happen if an area is added to the VSWI while a housing project is underway? When will the developer's right vest? The executive order specifies the most recent mapping, and that's a really good question that's important for implementation. So we'll provide more of a response in the responsiveness summary. Bernard states, under the new rule, a delineated wetland not on the map could be built on. Is it possible that a delineated wetland not on the map would have become VSWI mapped wetland if it was aerially viewed or boots on the ground reviewed? So the delineated areas is the boots on the ground reviewed. And we have a bit of a backlog of those delineations, getting them onto the mapping. We've had the statewide effort is the aerially viewed, aerially interpreted mapping that we have statewide coverage for that is being added onto the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory that isn't there quite yet. And Rebecca, you have more clarity?
You wanted to mention that that's federal standards and assumed out scale, perhaps.
Yeah, so it is based off of the National Wetlands Inventory Standards that's run by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's why it's zoomed out, you know, further from Earth and reviewed that way because in order to do an entire national inventory, you just have to look at it from a higher level in order to do the whole country. Nathaniel says, do the proposed rules change distinguish between permanent and temporary residential dwellings? Example, vacation homes. We can respond to that in writing. I don't believe it does, but I'll double check on that. Okay. We can hang on for a little bit. But thanks everybody for joining for this presentation. Again, it will be posted online so that you can watch the video again or for the first time and share it with your colleagues.
What was your channel? You said in your YouTube channel?
Yep, it's on YouTube. And I can provide you with a link for that so you can have it. Okay, thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Okay, it's still recording. So I will end the event. Okay.